There's a big focus by policymakers and municipal governments these days in electrifying transit, which means electric buses and shuttles and so on. But there's a big change happening behind the scenes in order to do that. And we're going to be talking to Josipa Petrunic from CUTRIC, the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. I had to work really hard to memorize that, by the way. Welcome to the interview, Josipa.
Thanks again, Markham, for inviting me.
Now, this is really exciting because we're talking about new technologies in which Canada is leading. And the first one we want to talk about is with the electrification of buses and high power overhead chargers. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, and I love when you say Canada's leading because I just believe we're the best place on earth to live. So I love this idea that we are leading the world in these great humanistic kinds of endeavors. High power charging is the idea that you need to get a lot of power into electric buses in a very short period of time. And the analogy to cars is like the Tesla supercharger for cars. But in the busing world, low power charging is 150 kilowatts, which is high power for cars. High power charging is 450 to 600 kilowatts. And some of us are talking about 1 megawatt of power. That is a lot of power pumped into a bus in a very short period of time. The idea is that almost universally, transit agencies really wanted to try to get to electric buses that could be replaced on a 1-to-1 ratio with diesel or hybrid buses. But the only way to do that is depot charging. And the idea is your bus powers up at night, you deploy it during the day, and it comes back and powers up at night. It just doesn't work. By the laws of physics, there's not enough space and capacity in the battery to only use the power at the depot. What ends up happening is the bus runs out of power in the middle of the day. So it needs top-up charging throughout the day. And the only way to do that is high-power chargers on the road where the bus pulls in, a pantograph usually comes down and zaps a lot of power into the bus in a 5 or 6 minute window while people are getting on or off the bus. And if the bus can access that charger throughout the day, like once an hour, then it can consistently top up and the battery state of charge stays high enough that the bus can deliver the whole service before returning to the depot to fully charge up overnight. That's the idea. It sounds simple, a lot more complicated though, because these things are big, they take up real estate, they cost a lot of money. Sometimes the transit agency doesn't own the piece of real estate where the charger needs to be deployed. So a lot of political and commercial factors come into play.
What about the electrical system, the distribution system, and the power generation behind those chargers? Because if you're putting in that much power into a bus, one would think that there could be, strain put on the neighborhood infrastructure.
Yeah, so there's two factors coming into play. One is actually the cost factor, that's an issue, and the other is the energy strain on the grid. From a cost perspective, it's a challenge because electric buses are cheaper to operate than diesel because electricity is cheaper than diesel when you put it in an electric vehicle. However, if you compare it to cars, you know that your electric car is cheaper to operate than your gasoline car. The difference for buses is the commodity, the electrons are cheap, but the power is expensive. And when you deliver power at those levels, you tend to pay demand charges, like the cost of delivering the big hose of power to the vehicle at that moment in time. And the utility charges for that. And so those demand charges tend to outweigh the cost benefits in many cases of going electric. That's a problem. So one of the solutions is integrating energy storage to mitigate. Energy storage is also a solution for the pull on the grid that you alluded to, and that's the second factor. Right now, the grid produces enough electrons. Canadian utilities produce enough electrons to electrify our fleets, but they don't necessarily deliver all the electrons at the moment we need it, at the power levels we need it, in the area where we need it. And so you can imagine a bus during rush hour needs a lot of power all at once, but so does everybody else. That could be a strain on the grid, and energy storage is the solution.
A quick question about your energy storage. So are we talking about a charging station that would come with a battery and it charges all the time and then it's all fully charged when the bus needs to be charged, and it can, so that you actually need a fire hose of electrons?
Correct. It's the idea that you could imagine at a terminal where a bus pulls in, maybe there's 3 or 4 chargers. but those chargers are all tied to a very large battery that's underground or above ground, hidden somewhere behind some nice graffiti art. But nonetheless, it's there and attached to that battery. So that battery would slow charge throughout the day and be able to deliver power at a higher power level when those buses come in for those 5-minute zaps. You would combine that battery with that energy storage with a supercapacitor. So basically some way to take the power from the grid at low power, keep the cost down, balance the grid, and then deliver it at super high power at the moment the bus needs without touching the grid, right? That battery is kind of the middle person that modifies the cost and the pull on the grid.
Very interesting. Now let's talk about cloud transit, which is data sharing between cities, between transit authorities. And I don't understand this, but anything that has to do with data is an essential part of the sort of modern electric economy. Why don't you tell us about cloud transit?
Yeah, as the name suggests, it's in the cloud. It's data in the cloud for transit. So I think this is one of the most innovative tool my teams has come up with in our entire history. It's the idea that right now transit agencies, not all of them collect real-time data off their vehicles. Like the diesel bus goes out, comes back, maybe at the end of the year, you can guesstimate what your average fuel economy is based on how much fuel you bought. But what we need in the electric world is really precise second by second calculations of kilowatt hour per kilometer and all sorts of units about how much energy is coming off the grid into your bus, where are the electrons lost, et cetera, et cetera. So cloud transit is the idea that we're going to put a logger on every bus, every charger, every fueling system. And these data loggers will feed that data, those data sets, into a cloud platform that CUTRIC is building right now, which our members like TransLink or Calgary Transit can log into, and they can see in real time how are their vehicles and their chargers performing. But more importantly, they can see how their fellow performance is happening in their fellow cities. So in other words, the Calgary Transit can see how TransLink's buses are performing, and they can see how Toronto's buses are performing and vice versa. And of course, the importance of that is the data sharing to keep manufacturers aware of what's working and what's not working according to what they promised us when they sold us the stuff in the first instance.
I'm curious to know if cloud transit would be part of the tech, would enable automated shuttles and buses, which you and I have talked about before, and which are coming in the near future.
That is exactly where we're heading with this. So the first step is collect the data from the driver-led vehicles and the manually controlled chargers and so on. Now, a lot of chargers, energy storage devices are already AI enabled, right? Like you don't have a person flicking a switch on these things. They're turned on and off and managed automatically already. So there's already a lot of automation. But if we can collect all those data, it allows us to performance evaluate in real time. And then when autonomous shuttles come online for first kilometer, last kilometer solutions, these shuttles will not only feed data into the cloud around their energy consumption, but also their near misses, their number of stops, the intersection left-hand turns, the number of times the traffic lights and the shuttles communicate to enable the shuttle to traverse the intersection effectively. All those pieces of data need to be fed into a real-time platform with very low latency so cities can observe how these systems are operating. That's different from the data platform for actual operations. Like the autonomous vehicles will be communicating in real time. We need 5G networks so they can communicate so rapidly that the vehicle knows to stop before it hits a pedestrian. That's a different platform that is operated by the vehicle manufacturer. But the data coming off the vehicle and the infrastructure that tells us how good is it performing well, how many near misses were there, that is so critical to cities that want to be able to buy this stuff and make sure they're getting what manufacturers and service providers are telling them they're going to get in their sales pitches.
Now let's talk about hydrogen buses, because the hydrogen economy in the last year has really, I was going to say exploded, but that's a bad metaphor.
Oh yeah, so, no Hindenburg references.
Exactly right. So, but it's very popular right now, and you are doing some work with hydrogen fueling stations and fueling networks. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we've been at this for 4.5 years. So I'm hugely happy to say that as of 2021, finally, we are seeing a lot of movement on this front, because for years we were yammering on to people who didn't want to listen to us. So I'm delighted that now there are some ears absorbing our messages. It's a great and exciting time. The first thing to say is The federal government, the BC government, the Quebec government, and now the Ontario government have either issued hydrogen strategies or are about to issue hydrogen strategies, because they recognize we can create green hydrogen off of very clean electrical grid in Canada, that there's already hydrogen being produced that's gray or blue hydrogen that could be absorbed for zero emissions vehicles to start the deployment, and that a lot of these vehicle systems, electrolyzers, fuel cell stacks are made and designed in Canada. So there's a lot of Canadian content, a lot of jobs in a burgeoning area. The second thing to note is we haven't had hydrogen fuel cell buses on the roads in Canada in over half a decade. The last one was with BC Transit in Whistler as part of the Whistler Olympics. And those buses were decommissioned by the mid-2010s. And a lot of that was the result of not having a hydrogen supply chain to support BC Transit in the deployment of those vehicles. So we call it a hydrogen homecoming. We have a big deployment project now being spearheaded by Mayor Bonnie Crombie in the city of Mississauga, and we're leading that with Enbridge and Hydrogenics in Markham, Ontario, where there is actually a plant right now producing green hydrogen off surplus electricity off the grid. So it's producing enough for 30 hydrogen fuel cell buses. We're working with the federal and provincial governments to get at least 10 out the door in the next year, with a ramp up to several hundreds over the next several years.
Final question, Josipa. This technology we're talking about that's being developed in Canada, is it fair to say that some or all of it will find its way to export markets, into the US and Europe and maybe even into Asia?
Yeah, it's actually the reverse. It's that they've already found their way into export markets, and the problem is finding their way into the domestic market. So if you're Ballard or your Hydrogenics, now part of Cummins, or your New Flyer, you've been making this stuff for years and selling it to California, to Europe, to Asia, and yet not to any Canadians. That has been the problem. And so it's this bizarro world where we've had these firms that have been generating a revenue and profitability in many cases off of their export market, but struggling to find a domestic client. And that is why we call it the hydrogen homecoming. Usually it's the reverse. You build your clientele local, and then you try to export and grow globally. So hydrogen has already got that global footprint. Europe's buying these vehicles and these systems in the hundreds, California's in the dozens. Now it's a matter of getting local agencies to be a clientele for companies that frankly don't have a reason to be here because there's no clientele here. And so if Canadians, we're serious about job creation, we got to recognize that a firm in a global world will go where the customers are. And the customers historically have not been here, so we're working to change that.
Josipa, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Markham.